supposed to do some reflections on this topic of the refuge. I think you have just recited the three refuges, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. So I think today is a fairly basic topic, actually going back to basics. And I think it's one of those questions we address when people say what it means to be a Buddhist, right? What it means to be a Buddhist, and how do we take our role as a Buddhist going forward. So I think the concept or the idea of refuge becomes really critical, really important. Yeah. So today I'll just share some reflections on what this refuge actually meant or means, because every Sunday you take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and maybe even on a daily basis at home. So I think it's very important for us to understand what is it that we are actually doing when we say we take refuge in the triple gem, right, or three jewels. I think very important question also to ask ourselves is why do we even want to actually try to understand what Buddhism is all about, or what is it that Buddha's teaching is all about. So this brings us to a very fundamental point. What is the essence of the Buddha's teaching? All right, see whether our aspirations, are they in line with what the Buddha had in mind, 45 years. He taught 2,600 years ago. So does that still resonate with what we have? So we look at the essence of the Buddha's teachings. This is from the Udana. The Buddha says, just as the great ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, even so this teaching and training, Dhamma Vinaya, teaching and training, has one taste. That is the taste of liberation. Okay? So this is a very important saying. So we should reflect on this. The Buddha says the great ocean has one taste, the taste of salt. And he says his teachings also has one taste. And that is the taste of liberation. So you can say liberation. So liberation, how is it linked to refuge? Yeah? So the Buddha says that his teaching has one taste. Right? No other taste, only one taste. Just as the sea has one taste, the taste of salt. And he says that his teaching has only one taste, and that is the taste of liberation. So despite many practices, despite many doctrines and skillful means, despite various schools of Buddhism that you have today, I think they all aim at one thing: freedom from suffering. Right? Freedom from suffering. In fact, someone once said, if you ask to summarize the essence of the Buddha's teaching, it can be summarized in 2 lines. It teaches us what is unsatisfactoriness, what is suffering, and how to overcome suffering so that we can find happiness. All right? If you don't like to express it in the negative, all right, like suffering, then the reverse is equally true. In other words, the Buddhist path is about how can we actually find real happiness, right? Absence of suffering. So that becomes the essence. So that's why he says that the essence of his teachings is one taste. It's the taste of liberation. Liberation from suffering. So is that what we are looking for? To find happiness. I think everybody wants that in a different way. Yeah. Therefore, taking refuge becomes the act of committing oneself to that taste of liberation. So when we take refuge in the three jewels or the triple gem, we are not choosing a philosophy or culture, but we are actually aligning ourselves, our lifestyles, our maybe even our character, with liberation as the ultimate value. Okay? So that is the broad understanding of what it means to be a Buddhist. Right? In order to understand why we are in this world, why do we have dukkha, as the Buddha used the word, unsatisfactoriness, and how do we actually able to initially maybe to reduce and eventually to eliminate unhappiness. So that is the very essence of the Buddha's teaching. How we do it, we've got different traditions, we've got different skillful means, different teachers will teach you different methodologies, even meditation. There are so many different meditations within the Buddhist tradition, within the Theravada tradition. Why? Because each one of them shares what is their experience based on their understanding of the Buddha's teaching. All right? So that explains why you have got different, you can call it methodologies or different approaches. But they are actually skillful means. All right? Okay? So taking refuge is the act of committing oneself to that taste for liberation. So let us explore about this concept. What do you mean by refuge? Huh? Today you hear every day in newspaper, you hear about refugees, right? So does it mean that you end up all become refugees and become take refuge? Okay? But it has got the close relation, the etymology of the word itself has got the same meaning. In other words, why do the refugees, why do they leave, for example, from one country to another country? In seek of shelter, in seek of safety. Okay? So refuge is anything you depend on to feel safe and supported during uncertain or difficult times. Okay? So here we're not talking about economic refugees or political refugees. We're not talking about that. But refuge from the Buddhist perspective is not about escaping life. So that's a very important point. Yeah? But about facing challenges with peace by developing wisdom, compassion, and ethical living. Freeing yourself from greed, anger, and confusion. So in the Buddhist view of things, a lot of our suffering, a lot of our dukkha can be traced back to three key roots, which the Buddha described as our greed, our hatred, and our delusion. So uprooting these three roots, right, eventually will provide us that answer, right, to why we are having unsatisfactoriness or suffering. Okay, so that is the ultimate approach, if you like. Okay. So then, why refuge? As I said early on, you find expressed in the Udana. It says there's one taste, which is described the taste of the nature of the path, all right, which is liberation from suffering. Now, what is this path? You may have come across this word, the Noble Eightfold Path, right? So that is the path. So in Buddhism, whatever tradition that you follow, whether it is a Theravada tradition, whether it's a Mahayana, whether it's a Vajrayana, it all goes back to what is called the path. And that path is a Noble Eightfold Path. Right? If any teacher come and tell you that my path is not the Eightfold Path, then he can't be following the Buddhist teachings, right? So this is a liberation from suffering. So refuge describes our relationship to that path. Okay, so taking refuge does not mean that just every Sunday morning you recite some words and that's it, full stop. That's just the beginning, isn't it? It's just the beginning. All right, it's the beginning of following the path. And what is that path? That path is the Eightfold Path. And this morning also you actually had a sampling of that path. You know what did you do immediately after you recited the three refuges? You took the 5 precepts, right? You took the 5 precepts, okay? So the 5 precepts represent an aspect of the path that you are going to follow, right? So it is quite pointless if you only recite Buddhang Saranang Gacchami, Dhammang Saranang Gacchami, Sanghang Saranang Gacchami, and after that you never observe any of the precepts, you commit all sorts of negativities, then it's a very incomplete. Okay, so you start with the taking refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and then you follow it with the 5 precepts. That's what you did this morning. Okay? So that's so you know why you take refuge. So taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. So we said the Buddha, the awakened teacher, is an example of enlightenment. The Buddha, right? You know the word Buddha is not the first name, right? You can't put your name, you can't call yourself Buddha Tan or Buddha Wong. Right? It's not the first name. You can call yourself Siddhartha, that's fine. Siddhartha means wish fulfilled, yeah, that's okay. Just like in Christianity, you can call yourself Jesus, isn't it? Possible? Yeah, you can be Jesus, but you cannot be Christ. Because Christ is the anointed one, the Savior, right? There's only one Christ, according to the Christian. You can call yourself Jesus. I think in the Philippines, many people like to have their first name as Jesus. So that's a first name. So the Buddha is not a first name. So please don't go around calling yourself, hey, I'm Buddha Wong, Buddha Tan. Okay, right? But some I think India and Sri Lanka, they like to use the word Buddha Dasa. Buddha Dasa, or a servant of the Buddha. That's fine. Maybe a bit too long on people, and then not sure whether you're Chinese or Indian. Yes, a Buddha Dasa. Okay. Anyway, Buddha is the awakened teacher as an example of enlightenment. Okay. Dharma. Well, I spelled it as in Sanskrit, but you're familiar with the Pali, so Dhamma, that's Pali. So Dharma, that's Sanskrit. It means the same thing, right? So it's the teachings and the path that leads to liberation or suffering. All right? Liberation or freedom, sorry. Liberation from suffering or freedom. And Sangha, Sangha is the community of practitioners who embody and preserve the path. So this tree becomes very important in the Buddhist scheme of things. Right? You have the teacher, you have the teachings, and then you got the supporters, so to speak. Yeah. Well, I mentioned here, regardless of ritual, style, or school, because I think in Bab, essentially very much so we follow the Pali tradition, more the Theravada tradition. So you have one way of bowing, right? Fivefold prostration. You go to a Chinese Buddhist temple, there's a slightly different way of bowing. You go to a Tibetan Gompa, then they have a sevenfold bowing, flat on the ground, come up. It's a good exercise, right? So they got different styles, right? Maybe rituals could be different, so different schools. But they all essentially talks about the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. You don't run away from that, all right? When I visited His Holiness the Dalai Lama some years back in Dharamsala, we went to his main temple to pay respect to the Buddha, to take refuge. The Buddha is Buddha Shakyamuni, and is Gautama Buddha. So irrespective of whatever tradition that you have, it's always Gautama Buddha. In the Chinese and the Tibetan tradition, they don't usually use the word Gautama Buddha, they use the word Shakyamuni Buddha. Shakyamuni again is a title, it means the sage of the Sakyas. You know, Sakya Muni. The word Muni means a sage, a wise person. So Sakya is the tribe. Then the Prince Siddhartha was born in the tribe called the Sakyas. Yeah, this is his wife before the Yashodhara was the Kuliyas. So those are tribes. So in the Chinese and the Tibetan tradition, they always refer to Gautama Buddha as Shakyamuni Buddha. It's the same. So don't get confused. Right? Somebody asked me, why is it the Tibetans don't have Gautama Buddha but Shakyamuni Buddha? But it's the same. It's just that they call it a different name. Okay, so that's so regardless of ritual, style, or school. So always remember, it goes back to the triple gem, which is the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. Now let's dive in a little bit more. The Buddha refuge. So when we take refuge in the Buddha, it's not just the historical figure of the Buddha, or not so much just the statue here, but in his enlightenment, in his wisdom, and, very important, the possibility of awakening, or the probability of awakening that he represents. Maybe you can say that the Buddha is the only teacher of any religion who actually tells you that you can be like the founder of that religion. If you reflect on that, the Buddha is the only teacher who tells you that you can be just like him. He's a founder, and you can be like him. You can be like the Buddha. Right? And this understanding or this appreciation of our potential to become enlightened is expressed very profoundly in the subsequent tradition, like in the Mahayana tradition, the Tibetan tradition. They say we all have within us what is called the Buddha nature, the Tathagata Garbha. So we have within us that seed to become enlightened. In other words, we can be like the Buddha. The Buddha did not say only I can become Buddha, all of you cannot become Buddha. He never said that. Right? So that's a big difference. So each time when we say Buddhang Saranang Gacchami, we should not just think of the stone statue or the clay statue. We can reflect on, yes, 2,600 years ago we have this man, Gautama or Shakyamuni, who walked the length and breadth of northern India, and he taught for 45 years. Thanks to him, our gratitude, we are now recipients of his wonderful teachings. Yeah, we can have that gratitude to that great master. Right? But in essence, when we say we take refuge in the Buddha, we also can mean that the potential that all of us have to become awakened. So that's a very powerful advice or instruction which the Buddha gave us. So the physical body of the Buddha is not the object of refuge. The awakened mind and the qualities are. But of course, we always have appreciation, we have gratitude to the Buddha who lived 2,600 years ago. Why? Because he was the Buddha who actually gave us the teachings. So our gratitude. Alright? Gratitude is a very important Buddhist quality. Like you remember that after the Buddha, Prince Siddhartha became the Buddha, he was enlightened. And the first thing he did was to look around, who could actually he pay respect to for gratitude. Alright? He wanted to look at some of the teachers who have taught him, they have passed away. Then he thought, this Dhamma that I have discovered is deep and profound and liberating. So he paid respect to the Dhamma. So the Dhamma, the teachings, his own teachings, we pay respect. Even the Buddha himself pay respect to the teachings. Okay, so that's the Buddha refuge. So we go to the Dhamma refuge. Now the Dhamma refuge, you can say the teachings of the Buddha themselves are valued. We value them not just as words or scripture. Right? You don't, for example, in our tradition, we have got volumes of Buddhist books, sacred books, right? We also have got the holy books, right? But we don't have one holy book, so it's not possible for me to take one up and show it to you. Right? So we have to bring a trolley to show you the 11 volumes of at least the Pali Tipitaka, right? So it's not just the scriptures. Of course, the scriptures contains the teachings of the Buddha, but it's the truth, the path, and the methods that's been mentioned that leads us to liberation. So you look at refuge in the Dhamma, you can say it is the transformative power of the Dhamma, not so much the text itself. The texts are just words. You don't get enlightened just looking at the words. All right? Okay, so you have to look at what the teachings represent, what the Dhamma. And this morning you recited the Dhamma, right? You say, Dhammang Saranang Gacchami. How many characteristics, how many features of the Dhamma? You remember? This morning when you recited. Or did you even know what you were reciting? Right? Well, you recited in Pali, right? So it doesn't matter if you don't understand that, right? Nobody speaks Pali, here. And anyway. How many characteristics? You recited to the Buddha, right? How many characteristics of the Buddha there? Huh? 9, yeah, you recited 9 characteristics. Ikitiso, Pakawa, Arahang, Samma, Sambuddha, and so on, right? What about the Dhamma? How many? 6 or 36? 6. Okay. You see, it's very important for us to also understand what each word means. Of course, you understand it in your own mind. So the first sentence when you recite Dhammang Saranang Gacchami, you say Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo, isn't it? That's a very long word, but the key word is Swakato. What does the word Swakato mean? It means the Dhamma is clearly explained, is well taught. The Buddha taught for 45 years. And if you remember in the last discourse the Buddha gave, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, he asked, Ananda, is there anything else that is still not clear? So there was silence, and everybody fully understood what the Buddha had taught them. So that same understanding has been passed down through generations. Thanks to the Sangha, the monastic Sangha. So it is well taught, swakato. That means well said, that you like the word. And then after that, there's another 5. Remember? Sanditiko, isn't it? What does the word sanditiko mean? It means that the Dhamma is something that invites you to test it out for yourself. It invites investigation. It invites you investigation. Okay? And then you got the word akaliko. Remember the word akaliko? From the word kala. Kala means time. Kala means time, right? So aka means no time, not no time, but timeless. So akaliko means it's timeless. In other words, the Buddha's teachings, the Dhamma, whether it was the Buddha taught 2,600 years ago or today, it is still true. It is always true. For example, the key teachings as encapsulated in the Four Noble Truths about dukkha, whether it's 2,600 years ago or today, it is still there. Right? Maybe we are fortunate, we can sit in the hall, we don't have missiles and drones falling on you. But dukkha, suffering is everywhere. Right? And people say it get nearer and nearer, isn't it? Now Middle East, it's not very far away. So akaliko, so Buddha's teachings about suffering and how we can overcome our suffering so that we can find real happiness within. So it's always true for all time. And what's the other word that the Buddha used? I think many of you like to use this word, ehipasiko. Right? Which means basically that it is the Dhamma is not again something for you to believe. We just start with sanditiko for you to investigate, right? So the Dhamma is something for you to actually come and see, come and find out for yourself. Again, the Buddha is probably the only teacher who actually tells you that it is okay to even investigate what he has taught. Remember the Kalama Sutta? Right? Yeah? Vimamsaka Sutta? So many other discourses the Buddha gave. He actually tells his disciples to investigate, to test his own teachings. Right? And it's not only in the Theravada tradition, even in the Tibetan tradition, there's a very famous text called the Tattva Samgraha, where the Buddha said, you must test my teachings as you test gold under fire. So that's the kind of, you can say, confidence that the Buddha has in what he has discovered. So you can go ahead and test. It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, you're going to find that it is true. His Holiness the Dalai Lama was once asked, every year he has got this discussions, meetings with scientists and neurobiologists every year, and one day the scientist was asking His Holiness, he said, what happens if one day, science or technology were to prove that the teachings of the Buddha is not true? He said, well, if that day comes, then I will give up Buddhism and follow science. But that day never came. Because what the Buddha discovered is akaliko. It's timeless. It's always there. So again, His Holiness was so confident that he dared to say that, because he knows that that's not going to happen. Right? Then the last two is opanayiko, right? Isn't it? Well, I don't have that here. So I thought because you recited this morning. Right? So opanayiko means that if we take refuge in the Dhamma, then our practices will lead inwards. Lead inwards in the sense that it leads to peace and it leads to happiness. It will not lead outwards. It will lead inwards. Because we always talk about peace as coming from within us, not outside. External peace, the Buddha says there are two types of happiness. One is external happiness, which is fine. You can experience that. But external happiness are very, very transitory. They're subject to change very easily. But there's another form of happiness, which is internal happiness. Now, that is more durable. It is more sustainable. All right? Why? Because it is something that comes from within you. So in the midst of unhappiness, in the midst of anxiety, in the midst of problems, you can still keep your mind calm and peaceful, serene. So that's internal happiness. Okay? So that's where, for example, that's one of the reasons why Buddhists learn meditation, so that you can actually understand how your mind works. So that's the Dhamma. So the Dhamma is a refuge. Okay? So while the text, the scriptures, the suttas, they are fantastic. They are really very useful. But they by itself, right, is not your refuge. It's only when you apply what you read in the suttas, when you apply what you read in the scriptures, then it becomes a refuge. Okay? So as we say, it's a means to an end. Right? It's not an end in itself. So that's the Dhamma. Now the Sangha. What is the Sangha? Historically and in the Buddhist tradition, When we talk about Sangha, we also make two types of Sangha. We talk about Ariya Sangha. I think this morning you recited the 9 characteristics, right, of the Sangha. So that we are referring to the Ariya Sangha. Ariya means the enlightened Sangha. So it could be the enlightened Sangha of the past, of the present, and of the future. So you take refuge in all those enlightened beings, alright? So they are respected not merely as a social group. So that's one category. The other one, of course, the monastic Sangha. Alright, like, in Babs, you invite a lot of monks to come. Maybe some of them are also Arya Sangha, I don't know. Alright, so, but of course, many of them would not be, okay? So, but they would be members of the monastic Sangha. So the Buddha makes a distinction even in the early teachings, the Arya Sangha and the Sammuti Sangha, the conventional Sangha and the Arya Sangha. So we respect both, yeah? We respect both. But today, increasingly, especially outside the Theravada tradition, in the Chinese tradition, in the Tibetan tradition, when they use the word Sangha, they actually include the community itself. Like the late Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese, famous Vietnamese monk. When he said Sangha, he also means lay people like you and me. So it's a slightly different definition. In the Theravada, they were not. In the Theravada, Sangha specifically refers to the monks, right? The monastics. So I just want you to understand that. Otherwise, you may wonder why you walk to a Chinese temple. They say, "Oh, welcome, you're a member of the Sangha." Then you realize, "Oh, I haven't shaved my head yet." It doesn't mean that. All right. In the Chinese Buddhist tradition, in the Tibetan tradition, as long as you are practicing the Dhamma, we consider you as a member of the Sangha. So it's a much broader definition of that. So I just want you to understand that. Okay? But don't argue with them. Don't argue, no, you're not Sangha. Only monks are Sangha. It's historical, right? So, refuge is in the qualities of the Sangha again, and not in the individual monk. But for example, when you look at the monk, it's the robes that they wear that represents the noble qualities. Yeah? So not simply in the membership or the presence. So here what we are saying so far is that the importance of refuge in qualities. Okay? So taking refuge is ultimately a recognition and reliance on the qualities that lead to liberation. Right? So you start off, for example, what are the qualities you need to inculcate? Right? Wisdom, ethical conduct, like you recited the precepts, mindfulness, and realization, not blind devotion to external forms. Okay? So in fact, many Buddhist teachers emphasize that the physical or formal objects are useful as reminders or support, but the true refuge is what they manifest. You understand this? You see? Now, there's a very well-known discourse in the book of Gradual Sayings, book of 8. There are 8 things here. And what are these 8 things? These are the benefits of refuge. In fact, Abhisanda is usually translated as streams of merits. So they said there are 8. What are these 8? It's a book of 8, AN 8.39, Sutta 39, book of 8. So there are 8 things here. What are the 8 things? 5 are the 5 precepts, and the 3 are the 3 refuges. Right? So here a noble disciple has gone for refuge in the Buddha. This is the first stream of merit, heavenly, ripening in happiness, conducive to heaven, leading to what is desired, to welfare and happiness. Again, a noble disciple has gone for refuge in the Dhamma. Again, a noble has gone for refuge in the Sangha. This is our first tree. After they have gone for refuge to the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, the next step is they observe the 5 precepts. So if you ask, where did the Buddha taught the 5 precepts? So it's in this discourse called the Abhisanda Sutta. Of course, there are a few more. I think even the Dikkhajanu Sutta, the Buddha talks about the importance of precepts. Yeah, but specifically in the Abhisanda Sutta, you find that the precepts are linked to refuge. Okay, so you take refuge and then you observe the precepts. Okay, now how is this? So this is linked to the third. For example, the taking refuge in the Sangha. Now the Sangha also represents moral character, morality. You remember you recite the 9 virtues of the Sangha? They're actually talking about upright conduct, beautiful conduct, basically talking about conduct. Sila, isn't it? All right, talking about sila, S-I-L-A, sila. Talking about the importance of ethical conduct. Okay? So the importance of ethical conduct is the basis. Again, just now I mentioned to you the Noble Eightfold Path. You remember Noble Eightfold Path? Noble Eightfold Path also can be divided into three sections. The foundation or the base for the Noble Eightfold Path is the ethical conduct, which is your precepts. Okay, then only you develop, for example, mind training, and then you have cultivate wisdom. Right? So everything is done on a rather structured and very gradual way. Okay, so Abhisanda Sutta is a very important discourse. So I highlight this so that you will reflect that taking refuge, while it's very important, it's just the first step. It has to be followed by the observance of the precepts. Okay? Observance of the precepts. That is why in all Buddhist centers, we have the taking refuge, and then we have the 5 precepts. And of course, before that, we have the Namo Tassa, right? So Namo means paying homage, right? Then we gratitude and we bow. You know why we bow? Because Buddhist teachings always talks about the 3 doors of our actions, the body, speech, and mind. 3 doors, right? Body, speech, and mind. So when you bow, you're telling yourself, not telling the Buddha, but telling yourself that this body of mine is willing to pay respect, have gratitude for great masters, great teachers who have taught us, who have come before us. So I bow down in respect. I bow down in appreciation. So that's to the body. To the speech, well, you recite the sutras. You recite the chanting. So that's to your verbal. And finally, to your mind, how do you do that? Meditation, mindfulness, isn't it? So body, speech, and mind. All right. So and all this, mind is very important because that's where the intention is created. Correct? Because the Buddha says in his discourse called the Libedika Sutta, the Buddha says through our intention, that karma is created. How do we know that the Buddha? How do we know? Where is it mentioned? Right? The Buddha mentioned in the discourses in the Libedika Sutta that it's through our intentions that we create karma. So the mind very important. Okay? So likewise, when we take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, it has to start with our mind. We must have mental clarity. We must be very clear why we are taking refuge. When we bow, it's not so much how hard you can knock your head against the ground. That's not important. It's not even important how many times, right? But normally in our tradition we do 3 times. In the city of 10,000 Buddhas, in US, in the Master Shanhua centers, they'll do in 1 minute maybe 108 times bowing. Keep on bowing and bowing. Right? So frustration, right? Some form of a dutanga, if you like. So these are the benefits of refuge. Okay, Abhisanda. Now, I thought I should also show you here. This is from the Tibetan sutras, from the Kangjo. The Tibetan canon also have got the commentaries and the sutras, right? You've got the Kangjo and the Tanjo. Tanjo will be the commentary. Just as in Theravada, you have got commentaries, right? You got the Visuddhimagga. So in the Tibetan tradition, they also have got commentaries, tons of them, and the sutras. Right? So this is from the Tisarana Agamana Sutra in the Kangjo, right? And you see the same thing, even in the Tibetan tradition. That amount of merit would not match even 100, 1,000, or even 100,000 of the merit created by a noble son or noble daughter who takes refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. So that's how powerful taking refuge. Okay? So this is the Buddha's reply to Sariputta's question about how much merit is gained by taking refuge. Right? In the earlier, this discourse that I mentioned to you, the Abhisanda Sutta, so streams of merit. So you find similarity in across the Buddhist tradition. Right? So a lot of similarity. So different traditions. So Buddhism developed into many traditions due to different cultures, languages, and skillful methods for different people. But they all share the same core commitment, taking refuge in the three jewels. So while practices and philosophies may differ, taking refuge unites all Buddhists in a single orientation towards awakening, making it the common foundation beneath the diversity of traditions. So let's look at a couple of other things like degrees of refuge. There is such a thing called a cultural refuge. For example, maybe not so much for Malaysians, but say people in Burma, people in Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, or even in Japan, you are brought up in a Buddhist family, so because your grandparents are Buddhist, your parents are Buddhist, so automatically you become Buddhist. Alright, so we call it nominal Buddhist in a sociological term, but I think in Malaysia we call it Wesak Buddhist, isn't it? Because they only come to the temple during Wesak. Where do you go to? Do you go to temple? No, I don't go. But Wesak, where do you go to temple? Oh, I'm a Buddhist. So during Wesak, they are Buddhist. Alright? So these are cultural refuge. So they come to the temple, they're not sure how to bow, they're not sure who they are praying to. They say, is this the only Buddha? Are there more Buddhas I can pray to? So why all Buddhas look different? So these are cultural refuge. Okay? Intellectual refuge are those, maybe they do a PhD in Buddhist philosophy, they know all about Buddhism, they agree with Buddhist ideas, but they themselves are full of suffering. They don't know how to overcome suffering, In fact, when I was in my younger days, there's a very well-known Buddhist scholar, I will not mention his name, very well-known Buddhist scholar. In fact, at that time, most of the books written by him. But later we found that he was a drunkard, and he died. He was drunk, so he died. He was a real drunkard. So someone who knows a lot about Buddhist teachings, who knows a lot about Buddhist philosophy, but doesn't put it into practice. And in fact, the Buddha uses an analogy like in the Dhammapada. He said it's like someone who has he every morning he wakes up, he looks down maybe at the valley. You see, he saw this neighbor. This neighbor has got a group of sheep. The other neighbor has got a group of cows, but he has got none. But he knows this neighbor has got 5 sheep. That neighbor has got 5 cows. This neighbor has got 4 male, 4 female. He knows all about other people, about the cows, about the sheep, but he himself has got none. Right? So he's an expert in knowing everything, but he doesn't practice it. Right? So Buddhist teaching is actually about practice. Yeah? So when we take refuge, it's very important that we actually translate our initial observance of refuge into the observance of precepts. That's when we transition into the practical part. Yeah. So practical refuge is actually shaping life around the path. So in other words, we will say that, look, we observe the precepts, we undertake to be compassionate, we will not intentionally want to harm any other living beings. Right? So that is because you are taking refuge in the Dhamma. Right? Taking refuge in compassion, in understanding the importance. Yeah? So that's called a practical refuge. Irreversible refuge. Insight so deep you can't turn back. This is maybe like, you recite in the 9 characteristics of the Sangha, the 4 pairs of persons, they've already attained different stages of enlightenment, so there's no turning back. I think all of us, if we are not, for example, have not attained to at least the first stage, so we are capable of making mistakes. But each time we make mistakes, we must realize it is a mistake, and with determination, like the Buddha says, with adhitthana, with determination, we tell ourselves we will not repeat that. So that's how we grow. That's how we progress on the path. It doesn't mean that from now onward, because you take refuge, you're not going to make mistakes. You will make mistakes. But the key is, you try not to make intentional mistakes. Alright? Intentional. So intention is very key. So there are degrees of refuge. So we can ask ourselves, if you are very new to Buddhism, perhaps, it's more of an intellectual refuge. But that's still better than no refuge. In other words, you appreciate that there is such a being known as the Buddha, who was able to taught people for 45 years, and then his teachings are still relevant today. So that's on an intellectual level. So maybe then you can move on to the next. Okay? And don't get me wrong, in intellectual understanding is actually also very important. Buddha says there are 3 levels of wisdom. Remember? The level of, one level of wisdom is through hearing, sutta maya panya, through hearing. Right? The other level is through thinking, cinta maya panya, through thinking. And the third level is bhavana maya panya. In other words, through intuitive understanding, through knowledge. So we must start with studying the teachings. We must start with the intellectual discourse. Right? So that's also important. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that intellectual is not there. Right? The Zen tradition, I think some of you know, Zen tradition, they're very famous for saying that no words or letters, going beyond words and letters. But in the Zen tradition, there are hundreds and thousands of texts, Zen texts. Right? So they also have got that. So they regard that as a skillful means. Okay? So it's a living refuge, a verbal affirmation, saying the refuge formula marks a conscious intention. So when we recite, there's a verbal, right? And then a mindful reflection is when we understand what three jewels mean in practice. So hopefully today's in my sharing, you reflect on what I've just said, so there's some understanding about what it actually means in practice. Ethical living will be expressing that refuge in your daily action. For example, in your observance of the 5 precepts. I think for lay Buddhists, that's indispensable. Shall I say? It's something that we all should follow. Yeah? So that's the ethical living, expressing refuge in daily actions, in our meditation, right, and in our compassion. Okay, so the Buddha's teachings is always not only on wisdom but also on compassion. The Buddha used to say that, his teaching is like the 2 wings of a bird. Wisdom and compassion. Just as a bird cannot fly if it doesn't have 2 wings. So the teachings becomes impossible if you only have one aspect. Right? And that is why, for example, there's a lot of... the Buddha, for example, is known as the Mahakaruniko. He's a great compassionate one. Why did the Buddha taught for 45 years? It's because of his compassion. Right? It's because of his compassion. If not, why would he teach 45 years? Right? That's the longest religious ministry, isn't it? Which other religious teacher taught for 45 years? Can you think of one? It's not 45 years. Okay? So that's the ethical living and renewal. Refuge is reaffirmed continuously, not just taken once. So maybe every Sunday you come and take refuge, right? Or you come to the temple, you take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. Maybe once a week. Maybe every day when you wake up, you have a small altar at your home, you can always take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. So it is good. Why is it good? Because then we set our mental frame, right, into a long, positive frequencies, right, wholesome frequencies. Right, it's important. So while the forms differ, by taking refuge, turning the mind towards awakening. I'll just end with some stories about how the importance. I think many have heard of Thich Nhat Hanh, right? You know Thich Nhat Hanh? You heard of Thich Nhat Hanh? I think the great Vietnamese Zen master who passed away recently. So during the Vietnam War, he saw immense destruction and suffering. He was exiled from his homeland for decades, right? But rather than despairing, he deepened his refuge in awakened compassion, in the Buddha, in mindfulness, and in living community of practice. So this is what Thich Nhat Hanh said. He founded communities, the Sangha, where people practice mindful breathing, walking, and deep listening. Practical ways to transform fear and grief. Because he went through fear, he went through grief. So he wanted to reduce the dukkha in this world. That's how this concept of engaged Buddhism came about. You've heard of the word engaged Buddhism. So Buddhism is not just for your own happiness, but for the happiness of society. Right? In fact, Bhikkhu Bodhi, he used to say that, sometimes, he's a Theravada monk. He said that sometimes the people in the Theravada tradition, they are too obsessive on self-liberation, they forget about society. They live in society. Right? So how do you make other people also peaceful and happy? Right? So Thich Nhat Hanh did that. He set up communities about how do people learn to listen deeply, right? So he often said that when the storms of life are strong, refuge in the triple gem is like taking shelter in a sturdy tree. So you read the life story of of the late Master Thich Nhat Hanh, you find out how important it is that if you have a refuge, a true refuge, the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, despite whatever shortcomings, whatever anxiety, whatever problems, whatever difficulties that you have, you feel that, yeah, there is solace, that there is a solution to it. So that confidence is there. So this is what we share. The Dalai Lama, right? He was forced to flee Tibet in 1959. After the Chinese went into Tibet, he lost his country, he lost political power, and thanks to India, he was able to have his homeland in Dharamsala today, right? So the Tibetans are always very thankful to the Indians for giving His Holiness. So in exile in India, he often says that refuge in the Buddha's compassion, right? The Dhamma's understanding of impermanence and the support of the monastic community kept him from becoming bitter or hateful. Right? I've met His Holiness, I've read many of his teachings, I've listened to his talks, I've spoken to people who know him. Not once did he criticize the Chinese. Never. I can tell you that from my own experience. Right? Why? He said, well, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, they're all human beings. They're all human beings, and all human beings have got suffering. So why should we create more suffering for other living beings? Right? And every year in August, there will be groups of the devotees, not only from Taiwan, but from mainland China, who will come and listen to His Holiness teaching in Dharamsala. Because he never tells the Chinese, okay, you go back and then you do an uprising, and overthrow the government. He never said say that. You go back and then spread peace and compassion, bring more people to understand compassion. So that's his message. So instead of responding with anger, he's a global voice for compassion and non-violence. In 1989, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his advocacy of peaceful, non-violent solutions to problems. He often says that meditation on compassion and the teaching on emptiness helped him endure exile peacefully. There was this very, recently you hear a lot about suicide bombers, right? Suicide bombers, and the suicide bombers, what do? They tie a bomb to their body and then they'll try to kill as many people as possible, right? But in Tibet, many years ago when there was some unrest, so to show their unhappiness, the Tibetans, they are self-suicide, so they just kill themselves. They don't harm other people. So that tells you a lot about the difference in looking at compassion. Right? So he often says that meditation, compassion, and the teachings on emptiness help him endure exile peacefully. Okay? So to summarize, so what is refuge and what is not refuge? So it is not refuge if it is a blind belief or dogma. If you come here, you take refuge on Sunday because you don't really know why you're doing that, because your parents said you must come. You don't come, then bad luck will befall you. So you better take refuge, Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, because it's part of our ancestral tradition. You see, up to the great grandmother, everybody takes refuge. So you also better take refuge. So if that is, then it is not real refuge. It is dogma. Dogma is like dogmatic. It's blind belief. Remember the Buddha says the Dhamma is ehipassiko. Sanditiko. Sanditiko means open for investigation. Ehipassiko means you must come and see. Come and find out for yourself. You think that, taking refuge in the Buddha, what the Buddha represents, makes sense. I want to do that. So it is confidence grounded in understanding and experience. Okay? So in Buddhism, we seldom use the word faith as in other religions. We like to use the word confidence. Right? So we don't like to use the word faith, because faith gives impression blind faith. So in Buddhism, we try to tell people not to have blind faith. So it's not worship of a savior. The Buddha is not a savior in that sense. Right? I don't know now, but when I was growing up, when I was in university, there was a song that, I don't know, Victor Wee or probably Victor Wee created a song called No One Saves Us But Ourselves. I don't know if Sunday school still sing that song. Probably not. That'll be oldies really, right? Okay, so it's not a savior, right? So the Buddha is not a savior. No one saves us but ourselves. But the Buddha is the teacher. It's like in the ancient tradition, the Buddha is regarded as a doctor. That's why in the Mahayana tradition, you got the healing Buddha, Vaisaja Guru Buddha. So the Buddha as a doctor. Why? Because the doctor gives you a prescription. No matter how good that doctor is, if you don't take his medicine, are you going to get cured? You're not going to get cured. So likewise, the Buddha says, I'm a doctor. I know what is your cause of your problem. I know the etiology of your illness. But this is my medicine. And what is his medicine? Eightfold Path. If you don't follow the Eightfold Path, nothing's going to happen. I may be the best teacher. Alright? So in that sense, the Buddha is not a savior. He's not here to save us. He's here to tell us how you can save yourself. Okay? So you trust in your potential to be awakened like the Buddha. Right? As I said, even in our Pali tradition, in the first the first paragraph of the Anguttara Nikaya, the first sentence, it says, this mind is luminous, abhasara. That means this mind is luminous. In other words, this mind has that potential to see clearly. In the subsequent tradition, they talk about, we all have the Buddha nature, the Buddha seed. Right? Religious label, okay? And inner orientations toward liberty. So it's not a religious label. It's not going around telling people, oh, I'm a Buddhist. Well, sure, you can tell people, to ask you, what's your religion? Don't say, I don't exist. There's no I. Conventionally, you still exist. Okay? Right? Isn't it? Because otherwise, you're not grounded in reality. Escaping responsibility, taking refuge, right, is engaging life with clarity, courage, and compassion. And it is a one-time ceremony. You take once and whole life. Not like some people say certain cold medicine, cold injection. You take once whole life. No need. But you have to take it as often as possible. Continuous commitment and repeated return to the past. Right? See, the whole idea is that Buddhism is about how to develop our mind, isn't it? And that's why we talk about our thoughts, our feelings, our consciousness. They are always subject to change. So how do we always ensure that our thoughts are always grounded in wholesome thoughts and not unwholesome thoughts? It calls for persistence, practice, and habits. After a while, it becomes habitual. Right? Then habituals become natural tendencies. Then after a while, long practice is natural tendency that you will not harm another living being. But it takes time. It doesn't start immediately. It takes time. So you develop what in Buddhist psychology is called, you develop mental tendency. Positive mental tendency. Anusaya. Right? That's what the word. Anusaya. In other words, you want to develop those positive mental tendencies. Anusaya. Okay? So, because of that, it has to be a continuous and repeated commitment. Okay, just to conclude, this is what His Holiness says. There's a wish to free all beings. I shall always go for refuge to the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha until I reach full enlightenment. So I think that applies to all of us. As long as we are not fully enlightened, I think our safest bet is to take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. All right? And when we do that, it's very important that we do it with not blind faith, but with understanding. Right? And continuous commitment to do it. And that has to be expressed in the way we practice our precepts.